Well, thank you. It's great to be here in Salford. The last time I was here was to film a charity edition of University Challenge. I'm hoping that today's going to go a bit better than that went. And I hope that some of your questions will be a little less obscure than the ones that Jeremy Paxman put to me. I think this is a profoundly significant moment for the future of our country. There's no doubt that as a country, we face great uncertainty and that we are divided. And today, I'm going to reflect on the last couple of weeks, the result of the European referendum, what that means for my own party, before offering some thoughts about how we move forward. Now, every part of the UK will have to meet this profoundly difficult challenge, but I believe that the challenge is likely to be greater for us here in the north. Those with the least risk losing the most, unless we get a grip of the economic uncertainty and social consequences. I think that my own party has a special responsibility. Many of our own constituencies, including my own, took a different view to their Labour representatives in the recent referendum. Nowhere more so was this the case than across the north of England. So I think now it falls to Labour to protect the interests of working people through the coming negotiations on our place in Europe. And I think that we must act now to help bring the country back together. And that is why a united Labour Party is needed more now than ever before. Because yes, our country deserves strong leadership, but it also deserves effective opposition. That is absolutely crucial if the interests of the North are to be best served. Now, the truth of the matter is that there are people right across Britain who feel that no one is listening to them. And understandably, many of them have simply stopped listening to politicians in return. I see it in my own Barnsley constituency. I think that Labour must speak for these people because nobody else will. They think that we failed to do so in the referendum and the country cannot afford for us to fail again. I also think that it is moments like this, moments of profound political challenge, which focus our minds on what brought us into politics. I joined the Labour Party to improve the lives of people right around the country. And I think that together, the Labour Party has transformed communities around Britain. We created the NHS out of the rubble of war. We built homes for families, and we extended the opportunity of education for all. But if we are to get back into power, we must convince the British people that Labour can do that again. Let us not forget that it was just recently the Conservatives who promised us stability, yet now we enter a period of extended uncertainty. So what I think we need now is a plan for the North from the government. As I've said before, Labour should lead the debate about how we build the Northern powerhouse and shape it according to our values. Put simply, we should seek to put power, wealth and opportunity into the hands of every community across our northern region. Now, if the government want to do this, they must enable local input from community leaders, from businesses and from the public on what devolution should look like for their area. There also needs to be a strategy for how the different devolution deals will complement one another. So today, I want to set out 3 key areas that I think the government's plan should include. 1, action for jobs and rights at work. 2, immediate support for the economy. And 3, specific investment into the North. Firstly, the plan must seek to protect the interests of working families as we reshape our partnership with the EU. This requires immediate action to secure jobs and protect wages. Throughout this process, we must ensure that competition between countries does not mean competition between workers and a race to the bottom for their rights. We should be clear that those rights we enjoy at work are protected and can only be strengthened in the future. The TUC warned that wages could be lower by £38 a week if we were to leave the EU. And with high numbers of manufacturing jobs in the north, which typically pay £100 a week more than those in the service sector, it is likely that the wages of workers in the north may be hit harder. So I think immediate action to support the economy will improve business confidence and support jobs and wages. We must also promote stability and counter the shock to demand. As the TUC General Secretary Francis O'Grady has said, the government must urgently set out a plan to defend UK industry and keep British jobs. Working people must not pay the price for the decision to leave the EU. So the second requirement of a plan is a big change in policy to avoid the recession that many now expect. This will require investment in infrastructure to be brought forward. As construction activity slows, investment in house building would boost the economy in the short term. And I believe that this can and should be achieved on a cross-party basis. Only this week, we've seen Stephen Crabb, who was one of the candidates for the Tory party leadership, and the Business Secretary, Sajid Javid, agree this point. Crucially, though, planning for the future requires us to invest in the British people. Because as we face greater global competition in the future, we will have to compete on being more innovative, more productive, and more creative. That requires a renewed focus on schools and skills. As Sir Michael Wilshaw, the Chief Inspector of Schools, argued recently, the Northern powerhouse will splutter and die if their youngsters lack the skills to sustain it. The early years gap between children from poorer and wealthier homes is twice as large in the north as it is in London. That speaks to the need for smart investment targeting early interventions. It also highlights the need for fairer funding of our schools. Northern schools receive significantly less per pupil than schools in London. We should also look at how best to attract and retain high-quality teachers and, crucially, leaders. The evidence suggests that our focus should be at the secondary school level. That is the point where educational inequalities widen sharply. The evidence is also clear that in no way should we blame the schools, because once school intake has been controlled for, the North East and the North West come out as two of the highest performing regions in the country. So this is a policy failure of successive governments. Northern secondary schools receive £1,300 less per pupil than in London. That is why we need to reform the funding model, not only because it widens inequality, but also because it is bad for our economy. Now, the government's response to Brexit has so far only been notable by its absence. But my own party must also take responsibility for the same failure. I am not convinced that a further cut to corporation tax is the answer, particularly when employers' main concern now is whether the investments they make in Britain will produce a profit at all, not the rate of tax at which they would pay on the profits. Becoming a Hong Kong-style low-tax haven off the coast of Europe cannot be the answer. It will lead to lower tax revenues, implying bigger cuts to public services, and it is far from the response that I believe voters demanded in the recent referendum vote. The right response is to invest in our people and our future to build an economy that is fit to compete. The third element of this plan is for big investment in the north. The government's plan should be focused on those areas which were left behind by government policy, many of which voted to leave. Indeed, only 11 out of the 72 northern counting areas voted to remain. Rather than a referendum on Europe and its institutions, for many, this was a referendum on their own lives. I think that demands a focused response from government to their concerns. The North has twice as many people as London, and I believe that we have huge potential to be a globally competitive region. So the forthcoming autumn statement must meet the challenges of Brexit and deliver for the North. That requires large-scale government capital spending to be targeted at those areas that have been left behind, so that it can be used to leverage even greater private investment. There is also a need for clarity around what will replace the hundreds of millions of pounds in EU regional funding that the North's most deprived areas receive. We've received £3 billion in investments from the EU over the last decade. My view is very clear. Those who campaigned to leave the EU promised that funding would be matched following any decision to leave. That must now be delivered upon. I also think that principle should extend to the protection of crucial funding which supports world-class research in our brilliant universities. The uncertainty of funding cuts and the risk of marginalisation hangs over the sector. As the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist Paul Nurse said before the recent EU referendum vote, scientific advancement translates to human advancement. We are proud of our universities, and we must do everything possible to secure their brightest future. That requires guarantees on funding for institutions and also a commitment that research and development funding does not become an easy target for future spending cuts. I believe that all of this plan must be anchored in devolving power, funding and decision-making process. I'd like to pay tribute today to Sir Richard Leese and all those other local government leaders for their achievements. They have demonstrated what can be achieved with effective leadership. Devolution has huge potential, not only to lead to better outcomes and more effective decision-making, but also to answer that call for change from voters we heard in the referendum. The north of England was once the economic powerhouse of Britain, and we must make that possible once again. So today, I've set out the need for the government to bring forward a plan for the north that delivers on that promise. The EU referendum result requires urgency in our response. That will require the government to act now and the opposition to be effective and credible, for partnerships between local government, business and the third sector which facilitate delivery, and for all sides to serve in the national interest. I think we all now have a big job to do to get this right, so let us roll up our sleeves and get to work. People across the north have demanded change, and we must deliver it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I just check, you haven't come with prepared thoughts to make a speech, or have you? You have as well. Right, okay. There was a little bit of, or maybe the confusion is entirely mine. So, Ivan, do you want to go next then? Please welcome Ivan Lewis.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to have the opportunity of being here. And just to give people a sense of how Whitehall sometimes perceives the North, I was born, raised and have lived all of my life in the constituency I represent in Bury in Greater Manchester. I was appointed a minister. And the first speech that I was due to make was in Wythenshawe, which is not too far away from here. And as I got out of the car, I read the speech that had been written for me, because I decided usually not to take very much notice of the speeches that had been written for me. And this speech began, "I'm so delighted to be back here in Manchester." Clearly the civil servant who wrote it didn't realise that that's where I actually spent most of my time. As Dan has said, we're living in tumultuous times, possibly amongst the most challenging in peacetime that we've ever seen. The consequences and the fallout from Brexit, economic instability, a deeply divided country, with the breakup of the United Kingdom a very real possibility, and turmoil engulfing the two major political parties. And one of the things I would like to say about this is absolutely essential that Greater Manchester, but the North more generally, has a seat at the Brexit negotiations. It would be extremely concerning if the future of the United Kingdom was about essentially the future of London and the South East. So I think that that's something that needs to be very, very clear from the beginning. As Philip was saying earlier, austerity is hitting the poorest, the hardest, and eating away at the fabric of our society. Working class alienation, so evident in the European Union referendum result, an alienation fueled by a significant section of the population who work hard and do all the right things, and yet over the past 25 years have seen their pay frozen or cut, their cost of living go up, and their lives get worse, or at least no better. There is a real possibility that this will be the first generation of young people who will do worse than their parents. And the proportion of the population working and paying taxes compared to those retiring is shrinking. And the cumulative impact of all of that is likely to be a widening in the wealth, opportunity and power gap between North and South. I've always supported Sir Richard Leese and the other leaders in Greater Manchester, who've been the pioneers of English devolution in their willingness to do business with the government. However, the scale of the challenge that we now face exposes the fact that the current devolution settlement conceded by Westminster and Whitehall is timid and anemic. We need a radical and bold new English constitutional settlement, supported by a new cadre of elected mayors in the north, who can come together and shape their own ambitious plan for a northern powerhouse worthy of the name. And I also want to be clear about this. If we learn nothing else from the referendum result, if Devo, Manc or other models of devolution continue to be elite top-down projects which cut the public out, we are storing up a whole load of problems for ourselves as mainstream politicians. So it's also essential that we look at devolution as not just being about a negotiation between Whitehall and Town Hall, but really devolves power to communities and involves communities as partners. I want to focus on one area of policy today where I believe that more of the same will do nothing to reduce inequality or support sustainable growth. And that area of policy is education. At the heart of fighting inequality, spreading opportunity, and a new settlement must be the freedom to create a local education system. Is education stupid? Should be the mantra which guides the priorities of the new mayor and cabinet here in Greater Manchester. There is no single menu to support a young person to fulfil their potential. But it is our shared duty to create a system which finds the spark to boost self-esteem, confidence, progression, and ultimately attainment. I have no doubt that Michael Cove's education reforms are taking us backwards instead of creating the 21st century education system that we need. I'm also convinced that the narrowing of the curriculum will consign large numbers of mainly working-class young people to failure and the margins of our society. But it's not good enough, as Dan was saying, for the Labour Party and progressives simply to oppose and to protest. We must also present a compelling alternative plan which aims high for all young people and provides a sense of optimism and hope about the future. So today I'm announcing that if elected mayor, I will use my first 100 days to draw up a radical plan for the development of a local education system here in Greater Manchester. An education revolution with the explicit long-term aim of smashing the link between social class and educational attainment. A moral imperative for a progressive project, but also central to our economic prospects in a highly competitive global economy where squandering the talent of too many of our fellow citizens will continue to hold us back. I will take this plan to the government, not wait for them to come to us, and make it clear that it's the key test of whether they are serious about devolution. As Dan was saying, the Chief Inspector of Schools has consistently slammed our schools and suggested poor performance threatens the success both of Devo, Manc and the Northern Powerhouse. Yet despite an often repeated lie, local authorities have not run schools for decades, nor should they. Education policy under successive governments have been run largely from Whitehall, and the current cadre of school commissioners are accountable nationally. If we're to reduce educational inequality, extend opportunities, and rise to the challenges of the future, we need a locally designed and locally run system in the context of a national framework. I would support the maintenance of a national terms and conditions for teachers and support staff, together with a broad national curriculum framework. But I believe many other decisions should be taken at a local level. A new local system would be central to the following: ensuring people that living in Greater Manchester have the skills to benefit from the technological and green jobs of the future, tackling intergenerational worklessness and deprivation, raising our levels of productivity and pay. My plan for education in Greater Manchester will have 5 clear priorities. Firstly, an agreement between the 10 council leaders to prioritise increased investment in early childhood development, from pregnancy through the first 5 years of a child's life, and this would be accompanied by a target for school readiness. Secondly, a new 14 to 19 phase of education with guaranteed work experience for all, apprenticeships and training as a high-quality option, beginning with young apprenticeships at 14, which can lead to university and to high-skilled jobs, but also to first-rung, low-skilled jobs. Thirdly, personalised support, including tutors and volunteer mentors for students at risk of falling behind, with an intensive focus on the transition from primary to secondary and the first 2 years of secondary school. Fourthly, every school to have healthy living and creativity at their heart through partnerships with sports, cultural and arts organisations. And finally, we must judge the success of our education system by how we treat the most vulnerable young people. So we must shatter the silos to offer integrated support to disabled children, looked after children and young carers. And we must reinvest in child and adolescent mental health services to ensure that they can offer families and schools the support that they need. I also will work with employers, trade unions, training providers and third sector organisations to develop a new shared commitment to lifelong learning opportunities for adults at the workplace and in the community. The job for life has been consigned to history, but our 21st century commitment should be to support employability for life. And older people should have the chance to participate in adult education as part of a truly preventative approach to a health and well-being integrated system in every community. Now, of course, to make this work, we will need new structures. And I want to give you an example of some of those structures. Firstly, I would create and chair an education board to oversee both strategy and delivery. This would consist of the relevant lead members from each of the Greater Manchester councils. It would have a majority of educationalists on it, including relevant trade unions, and it would also have representatives of employers, parents, students, and governors. I will also support and promote the development of collaborative federations, including cooperatives, which bring together schools and colleges and, where appropriate, universities. They will be able to share procurement, resources, and best practice. I will oppose forced academisation and any further expansion of academy chains. Over time, I hope to see existing chains replaced. Profit should have no place in our education system. I will also work with our world-class universities to create centres of excellence in Greater Manchester for educational leadership and teaching pedagogy. This recognises the centrality of quality teaching and leadership to our ambitions for a world-class education system. And I want to build on existing education business partnerships to create a new trust which would harness business funding and business expertise. I'm opposed to private sector involvement in the running and governance of schools, but I want to see businesses as key partners supporting the delivery of our education plan. And it's time to end the perennial rhetoric about the need for synergy between education, training and the labour market. It's about time we measured success and agreed what that measurement of success should be, rather than having these circular discussions about whether the education and training system truly meets the needs of the labour market. Now, for all of this to work, we would need much greater devolved powers and finance. And I would seek agreement from the government for the following in terms of this local education system, which needs to be part of a fair, not a flawed devolution deal. First of all, it is absolutely essential that responsibility for school improvement is delegated to the mayor working with local authorities. Secondly, we need substantial long-term additional funding on a par with London to create a Greater Manchester Schools Challenge, with extra funding to support schools facing the greatest challenges to give them the chance to support their young people to fulfil their potential. London has had a Greater London Schools Challenge for 20 years with ring-fenced money to support the schools working in the most difficult socio-economic circumstances. We cannot upskill the population here in Greater Manchester if we do not have a similar level of investment. I will also seek the removal of legislative and regulatory barriers which would prevent Greater Manchester creating a local education system. And just to reassure people that this is about raising standards and aiming high, I would propose that the agreement between the government and Greater Manchester should include a 10-year break clause, which would allow the government to intervene if using objective measures our local system at the end of that 10 years was failing. I believe that my plan for a local education system is central to our mission to fight inequality and to transform Greater Manchester. But I also believe it can blaze a trail for a new approach to education across England. If we're serious about raising our national productivity, rebalancing our economy and reducing inequality, nothing short of an education revolution is required. That's why I believe the localisation of education is not only in the interest of Greater Manchester, it's in our long-term national interest too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sir Richard, would you like to go last, but not least?
It's an interesting question. Would I like to go last? I don't think I got any choice over that once we got to that point. But good. I think it might be afternoon by now. But good afternoon. It's always a joy to be here in Salford and in this particular part of Salford. Last time I was here, I was talking about Northern Powerhouse, and I think I might get stuck in a time warp from time to time. Just a quick reference to the European Union referendum and some things that Dan had to say about that, a lot of which I agreed with. And I'd like to say that the local authority I'm leader of, at that area, we voted 60-40 to stay within the European Union, but clearly we were not typical of the north of England, and those divisions are real. They do need to be addressed, but I think we should be wary about having too many top-down solutions to those problems of division. I think one of the things we ought to be doing, something we're doing in Greater Manchester, is to develop asset strength-based approaches that are about identifying what communities, what individuals in those communities have to give, what they want, and how they can contribute to that. And a lot of work going on in Greater Manchester around that, and we need to be doing more of that. I think we also need to be in the north of England wary about beating ourselves up too much. And I'm not going to deny that we have some real issues to face, but we have some real pluses as well. We have, over the past couple of decades, seen the revival of the great northern cities, the development of new economies, new economic bases there. And if I look now at Greater Manchester, for the last year, Greater Manchester outperforming London in terms of economic growth. And for the city of Manchester, we've been a net importer of graduates now for at least a decade. We've become a very much younger city. And Experian, when they were doing a research into the difference between the 2001 and 2011 referendum, identifying Manchester as being the place in the UK with the greatest degree of vibrancy, the most attractive place for young people. Some things that Philip was talking about earlier. We also, if we look across the north of England, I would argue that we have natural assets that are the equal of anything anywhere in the world. If you look at our coastline, the number of national parks we have, the number of areas of outstanding beauty, our historic cities as well as our industrial cities, we have enormous assets there. Having said all of that, we are not performing at the level of the best. If we compare ourselves not with London and the South East, but because actually if you compare London and the South East with the best, they're not performing that well either. If we compare with high-performing cities in Europe, particularly the German cities, we are a long, long way behind, and our objective should be able to perform at that level. There are clearly some factors that have gone into that. In many parts of the north of England, the destruction of traditional industries, the destruction of our industrial base never to be replaced, coupled with what have been decades of underinvestment, partially because the way government, and it doesn't really matter who was in power, the way that government makes investment decisions means that those places are doing well are always more likely to get investment because they always deliver a better benefit cost ratios. And that's something that has to be changed, and we need, from central government, a strategic approach to investment. One of the things I've been doing now over the last probably 4.5 to 5 years is working across political parties and across geographies to start challenging that history, to challenge the way decisions have been made, and to build a plan for the North, and might take slight issue with Dan here, not a plan for the North from government, but a plan for the North from the North for the North, a bottom-up approach, those of us in the north of England deciding for ourselves what our plan should be. and for the north of England, increasingly to be able to speak with one voice about what it is that we believe we need. Because I have a strong view that if the north of England can speak with one voice, then for anybody anywhere, it will be a voice that's very, very difficult to ignore. It started off on this route around transport. It started off with the notion that wouldn't it be a good idea that instead of our railways franchises being run by the Department for Transport for London, they were run by local transport authorities here in the north of England. It's taken almost 4.5 years to get where we are now, but the two franchises that started, the new franchises that started this year, TransPennine and Northern, instead of being run purely by Department for Transport from an office in London, are now run jointly by the Department for Transport and Rail North, an organisation of all the local transport authorities from the north, from Leeds, with a presumption by around about 2019-2020, those franchises will be run entirely by northern local transport authorities. We built on that a couple of years ago after David Higgins was given the job of chairing High Speed 2 and doing an investigation into High Speed 2. And he published a report in March 2014 that, as well as making the case for why High Speed 2 was essential for the North, something, by the way, that is potentially under threat through the election of a new Prime Minister, in that, although one candidate, Theresa May, is very supportive of High Speed 2 and investment in the North, the other candidate, Andrea Leadsom, appears not to be as supportive in that. So some real issues for all of us in that. But David Higgins said, as well as the importance of High Speed 2, that we would only get the maximum benefit if we had the right local connections, and that the north of England suffered from really bad local connections, and in particular our east-west TransPennine connections. The cities of the north then got together, started working on a transport plan for the north of England. It was published in August 2014 and under the name One North. But contained within that transport plan were comparisons with some successful parts elsewhere in Europe, particularly looking at Rhine-Ruhr, looking at the Randstad in the Netherlands, looking at areas where there were effectively network cities that were able to have an economic potential where the sum was greater than the parts. It's that analysis, by the way, that led to what the Chancellor dubbed Northern Powerhouse. The idea of Northern Powerhouse didn't come from London; it came from the north of England. But the argument was quite a simple one. The cities of the north of England and the other urban areas between them are very, very close together. Here, as the crow flies, we are less than 35 miles from city centre Sheffield, city centre Leeds, city centre Liverpool. But our connections are really, really poor. That if we can improve those connections, and we can improve them radically, then we effectively create a single labour market for the north of England, a labour market of around 12 million people, comparable to London. And that changes the whole dynamics of the economics, because people now who quite reasonably feel they need to go to London, and the scale and the specialisation and the agglomeration it offers in order to build careers, would never need to do that. So the leader of Leeds, I heard speaking yesterday, talking about a new world where somebody living in Leeds, that if they want to develop their career, that they can go and get a job in Sheffield or a job in Newcastle or a job in Manchester, and they don't need to move house. It becomes part of the same economic area. And I think we are capable of doing that. We built on that with the Northern Independent Economic Report Review, which was published last week, which demonstrated that even now that there are economic sectors that are genuinely pan-northern and are of international significance. Advanced manufacture, energy, health innovation, digital industries, all pan-northern, all of international scale. And we have supporting capabilities around financial and professional services, our universities that have already been referred to, and logistics, in order to be able to support growth in those sectors. Transport investment is absolutely essential to that, but again, it's not enough. Skills, again, Ivan's just been talking left about the importance of skills is absolutely crucial to building the sort of economy that we want. Innovation, the creation of new ideas is important to that, but also quality of life. In the global world, people with high skills, high-performing people can choose where they live. This has got to be a place where they want to live. I just want two final things to say before I sit down. One about the governance issue, and I think what Philip's been talking about this morning around around a council for the North. Emerging out of the work we've been done on transport, we have developed a new governance body, Transport for the North. It's becoming a statutory body. It will be accountable to local authorities, so it'll be accountable locally, not nationally, but it's been set up because it has a real job to do. It has a real job to do of planning transport investment for the north of England. Going back a few years, well, I have to go back a decade. Greater Manchester first approached government with the proposal to establish what became a combined authority because we wanted devolution of a whole range of things from government and we needed something to be able to exercise governance over that. It came out of meeting a real need. And whilst I wouldn't say I'm opposed to a council for the North, I think what's described as what it might do is a little bit vague and woolly at the moment. And if at some point it's got a real job to do, then it might be something that's worth having. But I don't think we're at that point at the moment. The very last point I want to make, and it might take me back to what I said about Andrea Leadsom earlier. At the moment, by and large, what the north of England has succeeded in doing, get from George Osborne and the government, is getting promises of investment. Those promises of investment could very, very easily fade away unless we are prepared as a north of England to continue to speak with one voice, to continue putting the pressure on government and to be say as north of England that unless those promises of investment are delivered, that to not do that from the north of England will be completely unacceptable, and any government that backs off from those promises cannot expect the support of the north of England. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So let's open it out, but let me kick off just by picking up a couple of things in those speeches. Dan Jarvis, I mean, you spoke quite a lot about the need for investment in the north, a bit less in terms of moving powers to the north. Are you instinctively a devolver? What powers do you think should move to the north, and how would that help?
Instinctively, yes, I am a devolver. Greg Clark, I think, made a very useful point earlier on that I think that debate largely has been won. There was still within Whitehall, there will be people who will be resistant to it. But just a few years ago, I think we're still very much having the debate about whether we should devolve powers or not. I think we've come through that now, and the issue is about the extent to which powers are devolved. I also think, though, that we do have to look at this in the context of the United Kingdom. It's highly likely that at some point in the near future, Scotland will seek a second referendum. I think it is quite likely that under the circumstances in which we find ourselves at the moment, they would win that. So I think we face some kind of profoundly important choices about the future direction of Great Britain, about the extent to which we do want to devolve powers down to local communities. And to answer your question directly, that is my instinct. The more you can empower people, the more you can give people authority over the services which they themselves use, the better. But I do just think that has to be done within a kind of sort of broader context, which is mindful of what might happen north of the border in Scotland. I also think...
So what does that mean in practical terms? Are you talking about sort of a new parliament for the north, or giving the north control over income tax revenue, or what? I mean...
Well, I think there's a fundamental question that has to be answered about the House of Lords, for example. Is it right and proper in 2016 that we have an entirely unelected second chamber? I don't believe it is. I think actually there are many people who serve in the House of Lords with great distinction who bring huge life experience and add a lot of value to our legislative process. But I don't think that in 2016 that is a kind of sort of fit for a modern, outward-looking democratic system. So I think we need to look carefully at that second chamber and try and make it more representative of the whole country. And I say that as someone who spends Monday to Thursday in London and the rest of the time in Barnsley. And Barnsley feels like a very different place from London. I do think that we cannot afford to ignore the very strong signal that people around the country, around the north, have sent to us through the referendum vote. As I said in my opening remarks, for many people, this was not actually a critique of the European Union and its institutions. It was a comment on the fact that globalization has brought many benefits to our country, but those people themselves had not felt the benefits. They felt that their family, their community had been left behind. And that is a massive challenge for us as a political establishment to address those concerns that so many people have.
Well, isn't that the risk of greater local devolution? I mean, we went to Barnsley and we met a load of people who said they voted out because they wanted to stop the Muslims. You know, there was a lot of pretty alarming stuff coming out of your constituency. And isn't the danger of, you know, the situation we're in now is that you create all sorts of movements that you can't control?
Okay. The first thing I would say is, with great respect to Channel 4, I wasn't actually convinced that the piece that you did was kind of sort of representative of my constituents, who are extremely kind of decent, tolerant people. But they were expressing very legitimate concerns about the fact that towns like Barnsley feel that they've been left behind. The way in which we kind of sort of address that solution, I think, is by providing greater support, greater empowerment to local communities through local government structures. That's the way in which we do it. I just say one other thing, because it's perhaps sort of useful context. Greg Clark, who I've got a lot of time for, interestingly commented on the fact that the Northern Powerhouse was an expression used 2 years ago. 2 years ago. So I am instinctively not a cynical person. However, people will want to take a judgment about whether 2 years ago, a year ahead of a general election, that was born out of a genuine desire to spread power, wealth and opportunity around the country, or, dare I say it, whether it was an electoral ruse to convince people in marginal seats in the north of England that actually the Tories cared about their lives.
Just finally, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you and I have both did very political speeches, party political speeches, in a way that Greg Clark hadn't earlier. But I mean, you know, you both talked about needing to be effective opposition and the need for effective leadership. So I'm bound to ask you, what you actually mean? Are you the person who wants to provide effective leadership? Because you're often talked about as a Labour leadership challenger.
I don't think my speech actually was party political. I think it was... as a Labour member of Parliament, I think it would be strange if I didn't sort of cast some judgment on the fact that we currently have a Prime Minister who is in office but not in power. At a moment of great uncertainty for our country, we don't have a Prime Minister that is in a position to take forward crucial negotiations for the future of our country. I think it would be bizarre if I didn't in some way...
No, it's a zombie government and a zombie opposition is what I've called it on the television, the truth, isn't it?
I could not have been clearer about the fact that the country demands, rightly, strong government and credible and effective opposition. I said that in my speech, and of course, you know, people do expect that.
So where do you fit in?
Where I fit in is doing everything
we know what where Ivan wants to fit in. I mean, I'm asking you specifically. I mean, do you want to lead?
What I want is a Labour Party that provides effective and credible opposition. Not many people, frankly, think that we're doing that at the moment. That is not acceptable for the party, for the country. And along with all of my colleagues, I will do whatever I can to get us to that better place where we can provide that credible and effective opposition.
Ivan, were you trying to come in there? Or...
No, I'm not going to say whether Dan should lead or not at this stage. I think that the issue is that local government, local communities, frankly, if we're putting this in the frame of party politics, is the way that the Labour Party can demonstrate to people that it's still relevant, that it has innovative ideas, that it is imaginative, that it is in touch with people. Richard has done many, many good things in Manchester, as of Manchester Labour, in that respect. So I think what's important to recognise is a very important part of the route back for Labour to credibility is actually being innovative and imaginative and creative at a local level. And that's why I think some of the things that are being spoken about at this conference are incredibly important. I also think, left and right, I now acknowledge that the biggest single challenge facing the world, the country and local communities is inequality. And if you look at the kind of society, the kind of constitutional framework that enables you to tackle inequality effectively, it requires a lot more devolved powers and a lot more fiscal devolution than we have at the moment. And I think that there is a danger of people who have been the pioneers quite rightly celebrating, but in the scale of the challenges outlined at the beginning of my speech, my view is the current constitutional settlement, as I said, is anemic, it's weak, it's timid, and it does not give us the opportunity to tackle inequality in a profound way. So to give one example is education. The only powers we have in Greater Manchester over education are the 19-year plus budgets. We have said we will upskill our population, but we have no control over policy to do with schools whatsoever. And yet the Chief Inspector of Schools quite rightly says one of the biggest obstacles perhaps to Greater Manchester's future economic success, its future greater equality is its schools. But we have no traction over those policies. So to say we will upskill our population and thank the government for giving us control over 19 plus budgets, in my view, is being set up to fail. So I think that we have got to be more assertive in demanding a fairer deal. I do think that the mandate that new elected mayors will have, you have maximum authority in the early stages of your mandate and at maximum legitimacy. And at that point, I think it's for us to go to government with a clear sense of vision and plan about greater levels of devolution.
I mean, a critic of your plan might say all you're doing is moving oversight and power from Whitehall to the Mayor's office. And,
No.
and that actually you're stopping there. You're not devolving control over education further down to communities.
Well, first of all, I said in my speech that I do not favour the model of devolution, which is Whitehall to Town Hall. And if I had a criticism of DevoMank, a very big criticism, is that at the moment it is perceived, and it is to some extent, an elite top-down project where members of the public, frankly, members of my party, feel completely cut out from it. And that is an accident waiting to happen in terms of the European Union referendum example. If people feel alienated and cut out of a top-down project, they will end up punishing the people that they blame for that. So we have to democratise and involve the community and see the community as part of the solution. Look, in an age of austerity, in my constituency, councils matter, the business community matters, the third sector matters. But so do local informal networks, so do residents and tenants associations, so do those people who at a bottom-up grassroots level make a real difference to communities. It is not just about the interface between the public sector and the private sector and the third sector. It's also about active communities. But your point about oversight is completely wrong. At the moment, what is happening is early years are being slashed and burned because nobody's saying that our top priority should be the protection of investment in the earliest years, because that's where you make the most difference. We do not have the capacity to create a 14 to 19 phase of education with a high quality vocational route at its heart. We do not have an education system where we're encouraging collaboration and partnership rather than competition and academy chains. So, and we do not have an understanding that we need centres of excellence around teaching, around leadership, if we're going to aspire to be world class. So at the heart of our economic and social justice objectives for Greater Manchester has to be a very different education system than the straitjacket education system that is being imposed on us. As a consequence, by the way, not just of this government, I have particular problems with Gove's vision of education, because I actually think it's repeating the mistakes of the 80s and 90s. You can sign a whole generation of young people to failure and to the margins of communities, and you fuel intergenerational deprivation. But successive governments have centralised education, have sought to impose top-down education policy on local communities. So I totally disagree with the vision that I put forward, that all it's doing is rearranging the deck chairs. It's actually enabling us to create a very different kind of education system. By the way, the education system that we're told repeatedly by employers and others that we desperately need, but we're currently not allowed to put in place. So school improvement is the classic. The Chief Inspector consistently slams school performance. He looks at GCSE results, he looks at other measures of performance, and he says you are letting down kids. Now, what he doesn't say is London for 20 to 20 years has had a London Schools Challenge. Focus on the schools in the most challenging circumstances. What he doesn't say is that we have minimal ability to influence school performance at a local level. And what he doesn't say is the collapse of the institutions around schools, child and adolescent mental health services, etc., all of those services are making life incredibly difficult. However, we should have zero tolerance of this link between social class and educational attainment. What infuriates me as a progressive politician is that for generations we have not broken the link between the family you're born into, the background you come from, the postcode you live in, and educational attainment. And if we are serious about tackling inequality, that should be the top priority. It doesn't happen overnight. There is no quick fix. It's not short term, but you need a completely radical different approach to education. You need to find the thing that unlocks the potential and the talent of every single young person. The current education system doesn't allow us to do that.
Sir Richard, you wanted to come in?
Yes. First of all, I think to agree with Ivan to a quite a large extent, really. If I was asked, and I was asked yesterday, what is big that's missing from the current devolution model, apart from a whole range of issues around fiscal devolution and the constitutional position of local government, which is there are no quick-term fixes for. I would say the complete exclusion of 0 to 19 education and skills from the devolution packages. And even if you take the government's fairly limited view of devolution, that it's all about growth and it's not about, for them, about social policy, the exclusion of 0 to 19 seems to me fundamentally wrong. And again, this is not about who runs or who maintains schools and colleges. It's about what schools and colleges do and how they are judged on what they do for the young people that they're supposed to be serving. Having said that, even if we did have the right relationship with 0 to 19 education, that by and large is the promise of jam tomorrow. And if there's one thing I think the European Union referendum suggests, that in a lot of places we need some jam today as well. And it's something I do actually fundamentally disagree with Ivan about is that the devolution in Greater Manchester was top down. It wasn't, and I think that it appears to me a statement that we can have representative democracy at a national level, but not at a local level. Devolution is not an end in itself; it's a means to an end. You've got elected councillors in Greater Manchester that look at the issues that we had to address. So we have to address 250,000 people who aren't in work for health reasons. Similar number of, actually, bigger number of people with low levels of literacy, low levels of numeracy. I'll go on with a whole range of issues that we have to address, that we get elected to address, that we have manifestos that say we are going to address those issues, and we've been campaigning in Greater Manchester for devolution for at least 15 years now, because we've identified that as a means in order to deliver on our manifesto promises. Now, the big element of delivering that, apart from if we don't have economic growth, we can't get people into, we don't create jobs and we can't get people into jobs, the biggest element of that is increasingly a recognition that we need to deliver public services in a fundamentally different way, not big national programs, not siloed programs, not one-size-fits-all programs. That we need to look at individual people, the families, the areas they live, and we need to start designing public services around them and the places they live.
So
you can only do that when you have the levers in order to be able to integrate a whole range of public services, whoever is delivering those. That is the route we've been going down, and that is ultimately about those people who are aged over 19 but are excluded from the system, about the way we're going to be able to support those people to be included.
So you're saying you could improve all public service delivery if you were in charge of this?
Absolutely.
I mean, not you personally, but you know.
Well, I'll give you an example.
You know, there is no element of public policy, is what I mean, that should not be devolved now.
either in whole or part, and I'll give you an example of that. The devolution of health and social care in Greater Manchester is a mixture of devolution and decentralisation. It is a partnership between local authorities, health bodies and NHS England to be able to join up, to provide a joined up system. So you have to have the right arrangements for the right thing. Now, from a local authority perspective, apart from the fact that we want to improve health outcomes for people in an area that currently has some of the worst health outcomes anywhere in the country, we also want health to be able to address that wider agenda. I said 250,000 people out of work because of poor health. Well, if we're going to get them back into work, then we need health to be a partner in doing that. It's getting that sort of joining up.
Let me just open it up, Ivan, and then do make your points, because people will have questions to ask. Yes, gentleman with his hand up there in the middle.
Thanks. Piers Williamson from THFC. Dan, to take your point about Northern Powerhouse being created 2 years ago and being perhaps a little cynical in terms of the politics of the last election, we're likely to have one of two southern female leaders of the Conservatives. We're likely to try and maintain open markets, and that means fewer controls over immigration than the majority of the outers would want. Isn't a natural implication of that over time that if you follow the Linton Crosby school of kind of marginal constituencies and marginal gains, that the Conservative Party, being tribal, will reinforce the ground it has, and Labour will be split by UKIP?
Why don't you just pick that up straight away?
I mean, firstly, just the point about cynicism. I mean, not for a moment do I blame the Conservatives for essentially taking seize of an agenda about which there was much interest. The fallout from the Scottish referendum demanded a degree of change. Now, within the Labour Party, there was quite a lot of work that had been done. You had people like Andrew Adonis, you had John Cruddas, who had thought long and hard about the means by which a future Labour government would seek to devolve power. But it is a fairly crushing critique on my own party that we were not able to translate that into a product that we could offer up to the population in the context of an election in the way that the Conservative election machine, which is ruthless, professional, well-resourced, were able to do. So I don't blame them for doing that. Frankly, it is as much a critique, a comment on my own party's inability to do it as it is on theirs. I think you raise an important point about what this means for the future. I think many people genuinely have concerns about immigration, but I also think that for a lot of people, it became a proxy for a broader range of concerns about access to services, about their own lot in life, about the fact that they felt that their community had been left behind. I think UKIP post-Farage is there to be shaped for them. You know, if they are able to choose a credible, effective leader that is able to kind of sort of reach into those northern communities, many of which did vote, most of which voted to leave, then that presents very significant electoral challenges for Labour. I think we have to decide pretty sharpish what our own national Labour policy is going to be in terms of the triggering of Article 50, in terms of negotiations with the European Union, what our policy is going to be on the freedom of movement, and these kind of massive strategic decisions. The truth of the matter is, as people understand at the moment, we're not really in a position to do that. But I am mindful of the fact that we could well face a situation in the not too distant future where a UKIP party led by someone who has a broader appeal in, say, for example, in South Yorkshire, people looked at Nigel Farage and they associated with him a range of different views and policies which were not particularly popular. So even under the most kind of sort of difficult circumstances for us as a political party, and I'm thinking of the loss of our police and crime commissioner in South Yorkshire a couple of years ago, which was a prime opportunity for UKIP to make that breakthrough, they were not able to do so. But I think as a party, we need to be incredibly mindful of the threat that they pose to us. I've been saying for a number of years that we need to address that. I wrote a report following on from the general election pointing out in some detail the impact that they'd had, not just in the north, but around the country. So, yeah, none of us should be under any doubt that this is a kind of sort of profoundly important moment for the Labour Party. There's no rule in politics that says there has to be a dynamic, thriving, functioning Labour Party. Right now, we are in a battle for our own survival, and that battle is playing itself out and will play on for some time longer. But UKIP do pose a real threat, not necessarily to the extent at which the SNP did in Scotland, but we cannot be complacent about it.
Ivan, can I ask you all to be a bit briefer in your answers, so that we can get to more questions?
Sure, very quickly. Look, the Labour Party faces an unprecedented crisis. The middle classes don't trust us with their money or the country's money. The working class feel that we don't understand their concerns. We're completely out of touch with their everyday realities, which are tough life not getting better for themselves and their kids, and we've lost Scotland. So remember that this is an unprecedented crisis facing the Labour Party. What's the solution? Well, the solutions are not that complicated, really. They are the right kind of leadership. When the public looks at you and they go, is your leader a potential prime minister? And then economic credibility. And by the way, that's not necessarily economic orthodoxy, because I do think people want to move on from austerity. They do want more government intervention where appropriate in terms of an active industrial strategy. They do want a proper living wage. But certainly economic credibility is absolutely central. And thirdly, a vision for the future of the country, a story about what kind of country do you want to build. One of my frustrations was that in 2011, I wrote One Nation Labour. And Ed Miliband made one speech about it and then turned it into a brand when it was meant to be a very, very substantive idea about how the Labour Party could rebuild that coalition, frankly, of working class and middle class voters, because the Labour Party only wins when it has a coalition of working class and middle class voters. What we ended up being at the last election was having a collection of retail offers to people. We did not have a vision or story about the kind of country that we wanted to build and we wanted to develop. And the truth is that what happens in politics is people will start to look at the Labour Party when they begin to lose faith in the Conservative Party in terms of the economy or anything else. And at the point they lose faith with the Conservative Party for whatever reason, when they look at us, we need to be seen as a serious alternative government, and we're a very, very long way away from that at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Let's take two or three, and then we'll get them. On the front there. Anyone at the back? Go on then.
Hi, Claire Braithwaite from the Manchester Growth Company. Question, Sir Richard Leese, you talk about if the North can talk with one voice, it'd be a very difficult voice to ignore. And I think that's absolutely fundamental as part of the North reclaiming its power. How good are we at the moment at talking with one voice, and what do we need to do to build that voice?
Thank you, yes. And there was a hand behind you, wasn't there? Yes.
Thank you. Chris Jackson from the Civil Engineering Contractors Association. And you might guess from that I would want to come away from policy to a certain extent towards delivery. And so Richard pointed to the recent appointment of 2 new rail franchise operators. Associated with that, how do we maintain the momentum that we've already started in terms of investment in the infrastructure which will go to support their investment in rolling stock? And that spreads to the connectivity, not just between stations, but connectivity to and from our stations to link up the whole of the North.
Thank you. Because we've literally got sort of 3 or 4 minutes left, I'm going to ask you to be brief. And so, Richard, would you start?
How do we build the voice? Well, I'd say how we've been doing it at the moment, and it is a lot of people from across the north of England, local authority leaders, local enterprise partnership chairs, meeting and talking and agreeing common strategies. And I said, I've been doing this now for about 4.5 years, and given the geographical variety of the north, it is a task, but we've succeeded in doing that. But what Rail North has done in particular has taught all of us in the north the benefits we can gain from speaking with that one voice, because we ended up with far better railway franchises for the north of England than we would otherwise have done. And I think we've learned a lesson there, and that does give us now the momentum to continue having the discussions, building an economic vision for the north, building those strategies. And ultimately, sorry, this leads straight into the second question. By March next year, Transport for the North, based on an economic narrative, will be putting forward an investment plan for infrastructure in the north of England. And it is at that point we have to ensure that government, because we don't have fiscal devolution yet, that government provides us the resources in order to deliver on that investment plan.
Thank you. Dan Jarvis.
I think Chris's question was about delivery. I think it's about leadership. I think for far too long there's been a culture of decision-making for the short term. And I think hopefully having a National Infrastructure Commission will help that. Just look at the decision though around Heathrow, which has taken far too long, whether you agree or disagree with what may or may not happen. I think most people think we should have got to a decision much earlier than we have done. But in the end, it's about leadership, and it's about having people in politics who've frankly got experience of doing other things, of taking decisions, of delivering on projects in other environments outside of politics. And it's about people who are able to kind of sort of demonstrate that leadership by taking decisions for the longer term, and not just decisions that will impact on their own sort of short-term political cycle.
I think it's really simple. We need a vision and a plan, and it needs to be our vision and plan that we go to government with. It's not for us to wait for government. We need leadership, and we also need something else, which is mutual respect and relationships of equals. You know, what matters in these circumstances is people being willing to put their own egos and their own empires to one side. And too often, I think, both in the political world and the civil service world, frankly, that still gets in the way. And I want to just end with this point, where I agree with nearly everything that Richard said. I mean, I think that the Manchester's ability to achieve almost a patriotism about this city, if that makes sense, is something that we should all applaud and admire. However, and there's a big however, for large swathes of Greater Manchester, that is not the story. And the growth has not trickled down to those parts of Greater Manchester. And those are the communities that in large numbers voted to leave 2 Thursdays ago. And we have to recognise this. And also, even in the city of Manchester, which is a massive success story, 40% of children are living in poverty. So we've got to be also self-aware enough to say we're proud of our achievements, we're proud we're on the world stage, but we equally continue to have many, many challenges. And I think that we have to face up to the fact that the perception of most councillors, let alone members of the public in Greater Manchester, is Devo Manc at the moment is a top-down elite project. It has to change. Otherwise, we'll pay the similar price to the price that was paid, in my view, in the European referendum only a couple of weeks ago.
Thank you very much indeed. We've ended almost exactly on time. Can I ask you to thank the panel? It is lunchtime now, ladies and gentlemen, and then I think after lunch you've got the breakout sessions. I'm going to leave you because unfortunately I've got to go back and do the news. But thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of the day.